Toto. I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Alright, so here's a quick snip from the interview that we just had with author Jan Lamprecht on the war discussion. It's covering the AWB and Eugene Terreblanches, and the links, if you want to leave Jan a donation, are down below. Make sure you go over to subscribe to Commies Ride Free and the War channel. Everything will be linked. Our discussions are going to be linked. I hope you enjoy them. We're going to have Triple D on the 30th. And we're going to be having a discussion with Melissa and a couple other gals about homeschooling and feminism. And we're going to have lots of great discussions. It's going to be interesting. So make sure you go to subscribe to all those channels. Everything will be linked. And yeah, but I'm trying to funnel all of the views for the interview to the war discussion. So if you want to check it out, if you like this, you'll love the discussion we have with Jan Lamprecht. Just really knock you off your shoes, sweep you off your feet, I guess. But go check it out, guys. Everything will be linked. Thank you very much.
These murderous communist terrorists like Mugabe and Mandela and all these other people. But that's not to say that there wasn't attempts within organized attempts within white South Africa to save the Afrikaner situation. And that's one thing I wanted to bring up with you is the AWB and Eugene Terreblanches. I don't know, is that how you pronounce that? Is that Blanchy or Blanche? I don't know, but I know there's several people out there that have been looking forward to you covering this topic. And his 1993, was it 93 attempt in Kenton?
Yeah, Eugene Terreblanches was around for quite a long time. He's a very interesting character, and that name we pronounce it Terreblanche, and it might even be, when I look at that name, it has like a French sound to it, so it might even be that Terreblanche was a descendant of the French Huguenots, because there were some French Huguenots who also came and mixed in with the Boers. And, so there's a bit of French there as well. Anyway, Eugene Terreblanches wasn't a bad guy. And there are many people who've got lots of things to say about Eugene Terreblanches and the AWB. But I want to give you my input, because I've spoken to many people who at various times in their life were members of the AWB. So the AWB, in a nutshell, was a militia movement. So imagine you guys in America now, you form your own militia. So it's not part of the government. It's not part of the government. It's your militia and it's your guys and you've trained them. But basically, Terreblanches had formed a militia of whites. The militia was so big that it was basically a functioning army. Eugene Terreblanches possibly had the biggest personal private army of any white man in the Western world since World War II, unless there's somebody else that I don't know about in some other country. The AWB was huge. At its peak, it had 900,000 members. So just keep in mind, the population of South Africa at its peak, at the peak of South Africa's population, it was maybe 5.5 million, 6 million whites. So 900,000 members is a lot of people. And then of those members, he had like a military force, an actual like combat trained force of like 100,000. Okay, so he had real guys who were really trained to high standards, and they were armed and they were keen to fight. And the vast majority of the people, probably like the vast majority of the AWB, was definitely Boer, Afrikaans, but there were lots of racist white English who were also in there. And the AWB was basically this militia that saw the blacks specifically as a future enemy and who realized that whites are going to have to fight blacks by them, face to face, one on one, even though they are outnumbered. And I must tell you, the men and the women of the AWB were keen. They were keen to be let off the leash, to get stuck into the blacks and just start slaughtering them. Okay. But now there are questions as to, what did he achieve? Why didn't he achieve more? Because he had a real army. He had an army that was bigger than the Rhodesian army. He had 100,000. He had 100,000 people, I think, at its peak, like actual trained soldiers. Okay, and all those guys, by the way, all those guys were either ex-police or ex-military themselves. So he had probably the greatest militia that you've seen possibly since anything other than what Hitler or the Spanish did. Okay, but Eugene Terreblanches himself, he was a lowly sergeant, I think, in the police, and he was a good speaker, and he could sweep people up. Now there are people who say that he was sponsored, that somebody gave him money. There's even talk that the CIA may have given him some money to do this. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who was behind him. The fact is, he kicked off something and he ran a thing. And I think it started, I don't know the exact years that it started, but by the time I came to South Africa in the 1980s, it had already existed for years. And the AWB was proud. They had their uniforms, and they were keen to get stuck into these blacks. I want to make that clear to you. Everyone who was in the AWB was not afraid to fight a race war. They were willing to fight a race war by themselves, without the army, without anybody else. They just needed to be let off the leash. But what happened was, Eugene Terreblanches, being in South Africa, he's got a private army, but is he allowed to just do as he pleases? And the answer is no. The government and the military is controlled by white Afrikaans people, and they've got the powers of the state. They can spy on him, they can monitor him, etc. So I do not know the deeper stuff behind the politics of the AWB, behind their control, behind their plans to do things. I did meet on some occasions some guys who'd been colonels in the AWB, and they told me a few things, but I never really dug deeply into the AWB and its hierarchy and its actual plans. But they were kind of waiting for the war to start, sort of a thing. Then what happened was they did manage to get involved in a conflict where, when South Africa was becoming liberal and the president, F.W. de Klerk, was starting to weaken and soften, and he was starting to let the ANC, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, was starting to unban them and starting to let them get active and so forth. There were times when these blacks and Jews were actually active in some of these black homelands. There was a particular black homeland, I think it's the Ciskei. And how apartheid worked was that some of the South African territory was handed over to blacks, and blacks were given independence. Some of these homelands were, on paper, officially independent from South Africa and ruled by blacks. Blacks had their own government, blacks had their own democracy. So in one of those states, there was violence that came from the ANC, and Eugene Terreblanches and his people, and also some ex-Rhodesians, all got involved in that homeland to try and fight back. So you had a bunch of white right-wingers, who were trying to help a let's call it a pro-white black state, and to defend blacks from communism. And that's where they got involved, and there was some fighting there. But ultimately, there was a general from the military, his name escapes me now, a very famous general. and that general also got involved there, but he came and he kind of calmed things down and also betrayed some of the white guys. So basically what happens is the AWB is a militia, but ultimately it's answerable to the government and the police. It can't just do anything at once. And then you get other whites from the government coming in and also getting involved and misdirecting the whites. So if the AWB had been left alone to just go there and just kill people and just shoot who needed to be shot, they could have done great. But the problem was the AWB is always on a leash and the AWB is limited in what it can do. At a point in the conflict here in South Africa, the AWB did let off some bombs as well. They even exploded a car bomb that killed blacks. So they did a bunch of very violent things a couple of times, and guys went to jail. But the problem was that the AWB is never really free to operate as a proper army. And ultimately, the AWB and its leadership was limited by the law. If they went and did certain things, they themselves would be jailed. So that's the sad story about the AWB, is that you've got to remember the AWB cannot just do what it wants to do. It's under the law, and Eugene Terreblanches and any of those other guys could also have been arrested. So, if they wanted to really go wild, they would have all had to get together as an army, and everyone would have to stick together, and they'd have to probably fight off the police and the army, because the whites who are in charge are now liberal. So the whole thing is a mess. The AWB is something that could have been awesome, but I don't think they ever had a chance to really be awesome, because all those leaders could have been arrested within a day. And that's the sad story about the AWB. However, for the younger people who are alive today, even some of the minor things that the AWB did will appear pretty amazing. But the truth of the matter is that the AWB actually had the physical power to do even more amazing stuff. So they could have been really awesome. I do think in the future, for all whites, that we're gonna be heading down the path of AWBs and militias. That's where we've got to go, and everyone's going to face that problem, that the cops can come and arrest you.
Example of one of those amazing things is that incident in 1993 in Kenton, where they shut down de Klerk, and stuff like that. This may be a stupid question. Because you had Rhodesians fighting in the AWB. Was there a good population of Portuguese people fighting in the AWB? Were you allowed to be a part of the AWB if you weren't purely of European lineage? I know that you may not know that, but could you?
My best guess is that the Portuguese would definitely have been allowed in there. If there were any Portuguese who wanted to be there, they would have been allowed, because there were Portuguese that were allowed in other things. There were Portuguese who were allowed in the special forces. There was a thing called 32 Battalion. 32 Battalion was almost like the French Foreign Legion of apartheid. 32 Battalion is the French Foreign Legion of apartheid, and there were lots of people in there. There were blacks in there, there were Rhodesians in there were Portuguese in there. So yeah, the AWB would definitely have let the Portuguese in, because the Portuguese are white in South Africa. Yeah, definitely.
True.
So the Portuguese were never viewed as non-white.
I remember in our original chat we had over Rhodesia and the creation of Rhodesia, some of the most fiercest fighters for Rhodesia, were former communists, and who they took in, and they fought even more fierce against the communists that they were once fighting for. But
correct.
Yeah, but that's a great explanation of AWB. And what do you think do you think it exists much modern day? I highly doubt it, considering there's no purely racial organizations allowed, on the basis of race in South Africa today. So, I mean, I figured it would be almost extinct, right?
Well, there is actually a video that I did in 2017 where I attended an AWB meeting where the leader of the AWB spoke, but I don't think I recorded it. What I did afterwards was I did a video and I summarized what the AWB leader said. And I did that in 2017. Let me explain something about South Africa. You are not allowed to have a strictly racial organization, but there are ways that whites have learned to figure out how to maneuver around the law. So they form an organization and they say that they're allowed to have non-whites in there, but in reality, no non-white will ever pitch up there. So there are things that are done like that, where the whites skirt the edge and whites are able to get whites into an organization. I'm not going to mention others where I've seen it, but whites are not stupid, and whites also know how to skirt the law quite nicely, and they've done it in more than one place. The
Kind of
AWB,
a,
though, I think the current leadership kind of lost its direction, and I think they've lost lots of people. And that the people that I saw in 2017 were probably among the last ones who were still loyal to it. But I think it's kind of faded away. But there are other groups. Whites can always create new groups as well. And there are other groups like the Buddha Legion, the Statelanders, and all those. There are quite a few people who've got their little militias. Plus, there may be groups of whites that you don't know anything about who never advertise anything. So there's all
yeah.
sorts of funny things that could exist.
And I'm sure the AWB took a serious hit in 2010, 2011 after the murder of Terreblanches by a few of his workers. And if just in case you're a listener and don't know that, he was murdered in 2010, and yeah, in his sleep,
Yes,
unfortunately.
I have
But
some things. I have some things to say about that. Yes, you're right. When he died, that that basically knocked the organization in a huge way. A lot of things in life focus around the leader, especially if the leader is the founder of the thing. It's the same thing with Hitler and so forth. So if the leader goes, then a lot of stuff gets just breaks down. People quit and so forth. But I want to tell you that in my view, I wrote about this on African Crisis back then because I was doing African Crisis when Eugene Terreblanches died. I still need to continue hunting through my old archives, but I recall that prior to the murder of Eugene Terreblanches, that Julius Malema, who's still around and still talking about killing white people, Julius Malema was visiting Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. And Julius Malema visited Robert Mugabe about 2 weeks before Eugene Terreblanches was killed. And when Julius Malema and Mugabe were talking, they sometimes issued press statements afterwards. At the time, there was a black website in Zimbabwe that I saw them put out a story where they were predicting that secretly Julius Malema and Robert Mugabe had decided to start farm invasions in South Africa, and that this would happen shortly within the next couple of weeks. And that was published about 2 weeks before Eugene Terreblanches was killed. Among his killers there were people who killed him who did not work for him. One of his killers was a Zimbabwean. And from what I could understand, it was a Zimbabwean who also had been in the Zimbabwean military. So back then, shortly after Eugene Terreblanches was killed, I was convinced that Robert Mugabe and Julius Malema had organized the assassination of Eugene Terreblanches. I wrote about it, and I need to go and dig through my old archives. There's still lots of my old archives that I haven't fully processed. But I need to dig through that because I'm absolutely convinced that Eugene Terreblanches' murder was a precursor to real land invasions. But all that happened was Eugene Terreblanches was killed, and then nothing else further that we know about. So there may have been other things that went on that we don't know about. I do want to tell you that in investigations that I've done here in South Africa, whenever I've gone to places where whites have been attacked and things have gone on, and I've spoken to local whites and people who are linked to the police, etc., I've always heard additional stories that you never see in the press, and that there's a lot that Africa that will never make it into the mass media. There are times when farmers and farmers groups stop stuff and deal with problems, and you don't even hear about it. You actually have to go and you have to know those people personally and go and see them, and then they'll quietly tell you the story and show you the evidence. So make no mistake that whites are not totally helpless in South Africa, that whites, including farmers and police and private investigators, do many things that you will never see in the mass media.
So it sounds like the pretty much assassination or slash murder of Terreblanche was pretty much the kickoff for the invasion of white farmers' lands, because I feel like it's going to be a lot harder for blacks in the ANC to overrun these white farmers if Eugene is alive. Maybe that was a precursor, a perfect the kickoff. Yeah, I've never heard that side of this.
That was my take on it. My take on it was that that if Eugene Terreblanches was alive, that he would definitely have rallied his people.